Let's talk about time and space. I don't mean space like a Star Trek story. I mean the 3 dimensions you live in. And while this is not completely clear to me, I do understand it. And the tools I use to understand it are not ones that can be expressed in words, at least not any words I know. So I'll be approximating. And so consider this an approximation. Less than a science text, but more than a bedtime story. And there are a few reasons this is useful. One is that someday your scientists will mature enough to ask some of these questions. And hopefully they can hear this and have some idea where to start poking. It's also helpful to your sensors when they want to start sensing beyond the tiny little space of constrained reality their habits have taught them about. They'll need to have a little awareness of how it's put together. And likewise, your shapers, if they ever become good enough to do an impressive shaping, this will affect them. So, how is time put together? And what's wrong with the way you think about it that it needs to change? Right now, most of you talk about a timeline. And if you're planning a project or working on something, you talk about the timeline, and the next week we'll be doing this or that. But you actually believe in this timeline. You believe August 2nd, 1983 is an exact distance away in time. And it's 24 hours away from August 3rd, 1983. And you think of time as a thing that runs along a line with exactly consistent units all the way along. Now, your fellow Einstein was a little smarter. Rather than saying time is some mysterious thing marked out by clocks, he said it's just another dimension like space. But if you look at his work, he seems to say again and again that, well, it's just another dimension, but it's totally different than space because it has different units, and so you can't put them together. He still, like the rest of you, seemed to believe that time was pretty much a constant. Yes, he imagined going close to the speed of light and changing your relative time, but when you'd come back to a time that was marching with more than German efficiency, exactly along a line. You think of it a little bit like you're a passenger in a train car, riding along the tracks. And when it's 1 second later for you, or 1 day later, it's 1 second or 1 day later for everybody on the train. And you think that you can't move half a millisecond into the future or the past. You're totally constrained. I had a passenger on a train car could walk forward or backward on the train. You can't even do that. You can't even lean a little bit forward or backwards and vary the timeline. You're like, I don't know, a Han Solo or one of King Midas's lovers, turned into a block of some metal and totally unmoving, and unable to change even the tiniest fraction of time as you ride along on this train track. And most of you think that's a very intelligent way to think about it. And I want you to consider the possibility that it's not. Now, in a lot of your fiction movies, and in some cases in your science, you talk about traveling through time. And you talk about things like paradoxes and time quakes. And you talk about jumping to alternate timelines. Just about everybody's heard of parallel realities or parallel worlds. There are incredible numbers of movies and books and TV shows about it. And most physicists will actually tell you that parallel worlds are possible. That it's possible to jump from this to another world, and they have no idea how to do it, but they can do the calculations and it's possible. And most physicists will tell you that time travel is impossible. Or at least so exceedingly difficult that it's effectively impossible. You might slingshot around a black hole or something. Now, when you time travel, think of the movie The One with Jet Li, where they're not time traveling, where they're jumping through different timelines. Have you ever noticed that in any of your stories it's never a second ahead or a second behind when you get to a different time stream? They don't run slower or faster. The only place I've seen that is in some very fringe fantasy books. That if you pop into a parallel time stream, somehow an alternate reality, and you come back, a certain amount of time will have passed. I suppose there are ancient European legends of going into an alternate time stream like fairy and coming back much, much later. Even though little time had passed there, much had passed back home. But for the most part, all of your people, the technical people, seem to think that all of these time streams are as locked into this German clock idea as your own time stream. That in fact, every one of them are on their own train tracks, barreling through whatever they're barreling through, and all at exactly the same speed without any speed up or slow down. Figure if the speed up or slow down were even a millisecond of difference in an hour. Something so minuscule you couldn't measure it. That over billions of years, the time streams would drift apart. You wouldn't go to an alternate reality and find yourself there. You'd find it was 2,000 years in the past or 10,000 years in the future. And that is something you think can happen. So your idea, it's very it's like the idea of all the planets working in a perfect sphere just because, it's rigid and logical. In reality, they don't work that way. Your image seems to be, when I look at it, a vast number of trains where all the people are frozen into blocks of cement and can't move even a millimeter, and all of them running through this, whatever they run through, at exactly the same speed and time, perfectly synchronized to one another. This vast horde of trains running across some inconceivable plane, and all exactly rigidly locked in place. And when you start looking at it like that, it starts seeming a bit silly. I hope it seems a bit silly that the metaphors you use don't scale when you start actually trying to put the pieces together. I want to suggest to you that time travel is possible, whether you're moving something of substance forward or backwards in time, or simply moving your awareness forwards or backwards in time. That anyone who's a competent sensor can already do this. Go back and find out, for instance, that the Mona Lisa was burned a long time ago. That Shakespeare was a group and not a person. That Jesus, the God story, is a myth. Any competent sensor can do this. And in effect, what you're doing is time traveling. You're sending your awareness forward or backward in time. Now, when I talk about going forward in time, it leads to another piece of silliness. Most of you talk about, like the Oedipus story. When you have a glimpse of the future, you can make different choices and maybe lead to a different future, or maybe end up creating exactly what was predicted. But the idea that behind you, time is fixed in stone or in steel rails, and ahead of you it's completely nebulous and uncharted. As if you are some sort of meta zipper traveling through whatever it is you're traveling through, sealing it closed as you go. And this too is a very preposterous idea when you start extending it across enough possibilities. Another issue that I've heard expressed, something that doesn't really work, is I have heard very intelligent people espouse the idea that every time you make a decision, you actually make both separate decisions, or all the separate decisions, and simply spin off an alternate reality. Now, lots of people think that's reasonable. But you see these realities as railroad tracks, as timelines. If that's the case, then in every instant, you yourself are spinning off lots and lots of extra lines. And given the length that your world's been around, and the number of people and animals and bugs and whatnot, all of them making every possible decision, what you find is that the number of available timelines quickly becomes so vast that you couldn't easily calculate the number. You probably couldn't calculate at all, you'd have to guess. So, how can there be that many lines? Where exactly are these lines? And that's the next question. You talk about yourself in a timeline. What are you traveling through? Well, you're traveling through time. But sure, time is a line. How can you travel through it? If you're traveling in a line down here and somebody else is traveling on a parallel line, then you've just defined a plane. And if there's more than two possible realities, you just hypothesize there's an infinite number of them, then you've created at least a volume. You've created something complex. And the idea that over the entire span of history, whatever that is, every decision has spun off another timeline, and they're all running parallel and are exactly in sync, more efficient than German trains. How big is this space? It's sort of like imagining an infinite number of snakes crawling through a tunnel, all perfectly in sync and side by side. Infinitely many of them, and yet none of them are close enough to touch or even to notice one another. It either becomes a matter of religion at this point, where you close your eyes to the questions and just say, well, I believe it, so it has to be. Or it's something you understand as best you can in terms of your physics, your understanding of how things are put together. And in terms of your physics, you can't have an infinite number of things crawling along side by side. They would overlap and smash into one another, and eventually you'd have a big snake pudding crammed into the tunnel, and it would be very messy. And all of these timelines would have to come to an end. There are, in short, a lot of problems with your idea of how time works. Not the least that you don't know what it is the timeline is moving through. in effect, you're defining a space and calling it the time-space. X number of dimensions of time, which our timeline moves through. And all the parallel worlds, their timelines move through it too. But you never define what that space is. And if you ask someone, they wouldn't even really understand the question. Time and space, they're different, but you're defining time as a line. You're defining it as a construct that occupies a space. To do that, there must be a space it moves through. If there are many lines, it must be a space that allows many lines. And so clearly there can't be an infinite number of lines. Every decision can't bring off another, or whatever this space is, unless it's, sort of a God space that's all-knowing and fills all of the potential and infinitely large. Unless you want to hypothesize some sort of God metaphor, there can't be an infinite number of parallel realities. So, there can't be an infinite number. They can't all be in lockstep. That's unreasonable. They must be related or connected somehow. Unlikely that they're all totally independent. Things all affect one another, even if the effect is minuscule. And they move through some undefined space, some unknown number of dimensions that's strictly set aside for time. So, basically, everything I understand of how time works. Now, I'm reasonably well educated in modern physics and engineering. I've read the works of Einstein, who was a thinker way outside the box in his exploration of time. And I've read some very fringe but very intelligent authors on this subject. And from what I understand, what you guys have created is a potentially infinite number of train tracks running through an utterly undefined, God-sized space, but never intersecting, and all rigidly locked in sync like some sort of German clock. And it's just preposterous to think that you people can believe such nonsense. Look at any branch of science and tell me it works that way. The crust of the earth travels at a very slightly different speed than the layer just below it. They don't travel exactly in sync. The planets are not exactly spherical. They have slight variation. That variation is changing constantly, depending on gravitation of other bodies and slight disruptions in space and all manner of things. Things don't move in lockstep. They're not rigid lines traveling through some vast engineering structure. It's much more organic than that. And you need an organic understanding of time. So I will try and paint a picture. Somebody else perhaps can write the mathematics. For now, because it's easiest to think in 3 dimensions or less, let's hypothesize a time volume. A volume of 3 dimensions, just like there is a space volume. Up, down, left, right, front, back. Just as you can move through that space volume, you can walk across the room, or stand up, or sit down, or take an elevator. You can move through that space volume. You move through that time volume. And for reasons that are outside the scope, at this point your perception is limited, so you see yourself moving through at an exactly rigid pace that you can't change. But that's a mythical limit. You could easily change that pace and move through faster or slower. Like, the Flash in the comic books. And you can move forward or backwards. Though at present you don't have the technology, whether it's meta technology or physical, to do so, you can. And it's no more nor less complicated than jumping to an alternate timeline. because an alternate timeline is running through that volume of space. And so if you can move forward or backwards on your timeline, you can move left or right. And that other timeline is going to be, left or right. It's going to be somewhere within this volume. It's not helpful to hypothesize a God-sized thing and give it some mythical import. It is a limited time volume. And so if you move left or right or up or down, you'll intersect another one of these lines and find yourself on a different timeline. Now, next, the idea that the future is this completely nebulous, undecided thing and the past is some absolute linear line. That's silly. That's the cosmic zipper theory. It's buffoonery. You move through this time volume, and you're mostly aware of the past and mostly not aware of the future. And so you are following some course through it. You as an individual, you as a planet, you as what you know as reality. But it's following something that can be charted by an equation. It's following a path. It has a graph through this time volume. In fact, it can easily be understood as more than 3 dimensions, but we'll call it volume now because that's easier. So you're moving through this time volume. You could draw a graph of it. And so if you understood the graph, you could simply calculate where things are going to be in 10 minutes or 1,000 years. And the reason that this unsettles or upsets people is the religious idea of free will. If we're following some sort of timeline, then our decisions don't matter. We're like machines. Now again, you're back to this whole German idea of machines. It's more organic than that. The decisions you make, the decisions that larger patterns and structures make, defines the path that you will follow. But if you were to move the other way along that timeline, you would see that as the past and your past as the future. This is not such a strange concept. Doctor Who explores this, and that's clearly written for people of very limited intellect. It's not completely fixed in one direction and nebulous in another. You will, across time, follow an exact path. The only reason one seems nebulous is you can see backwards and can't see forward. But people standing in a slightly different place in this time volume could easily see your past and your future because they see the path you're following. Now, are there an infinite number of alternate realities? The simplest answer is no, because we've hypothesized a limited volume. But the problem with this, the reason it's confusing, is your idea of a timeline. That things follow some rigid line that you're fixed to. It doesn't. Time is a volume, and you can move around that volume. You could move left or right instead of just forward. So, as such, a timeline is simply a way of understanding, charting here's where I was and here's where I'm going. It's a graph that represents your progress through this time volume. But it's not a rigid, fixed thing. There are no timelines. Well, there are no absolute timelines. You can always understand a given, think of it as a particle moving through the space, as having a. Now in these alternate timelines, there are alternate yous, alternate versions of yourself. But see, that gets confusing. You hit questions like, oh, how would you handle an alternate you? There's a recent TV show about two worlds colliding in New York and how these people were handling it. And there's the movie I mentioned earlier with Jet Li, the one that you can go through and kill people in other timelines and get stronger because your mana or your spirit isn't wasted across all these. But see, that's not actually how it works. The answer is much more simple and much more organic, and it gets rid of things like time paradoxes. If you went back in time and killed your grandparents, you wouldn't have been born, so you couldn't go back and kill your grandparents. Oh my God, everything breaks, the clock stops. Again, we're back to this German mechanical understanding of things, and that needs to stop. What is far more organic, far less mechanical. So, imagine a glass of water. A glass of water is made up of molecules. Dihydrogen oxide, H2O, with, an oxygen sitting in the middle and two hydrogens at about 120 degrees apart, making it slightly polar. Most of you have a little science have seen this image. And if you look at one part of that, say the hydrogen atom, what you're going to find is that there is a nucleus, and there's an electron spinning around that. And you can picture it like a planet rotating around a sun. Right? But if you could get small enough to look at it, understand this is a theoretical exercise. If you got that small, you couldn't actually have the structures to see it, and the photon of light wouldn't work, and so on. But if you could theoretically get small enough, like Einstein writing a light beam, would you see a little planet rotating around a sun? Well, even your modern understanding of physics recognizes that this isn't true. You wouldn't see that. It was said in a very clumsy and childish way by Heisenberg in his uncertainty principle. And more eloquently, it can be said as the electron is a unit, doesn't exist. It's not a single thing running around a nucleus. It's simply a probability distribution. There's a distribution of energy around it, which at any given moment can be represented as a solid thing. But in fact, it's a distribution of potential around this nucleus. There isn't a single electron. There's only a mathematical distribution of the energy of that electron. And most of you who have a little bit of science understanding have heard this and are not completely baffled by it, or are baffled by it, but accept it because science says so. And I say that's much closer to the truth. But see, again, this is like writing the light beam with Einstein. Imagine you were that electron. What would you perceive? At any given instant in time, you would probably see yourself. I'm here. I'm an electron. I'm here. It's there. I'm running around it. You wouldn't perceive yourself as some vast distributed potential, but as a thing. Just as you humans do. You don't see yourself as a vast distributed potential, but as a concrete thing. Right here. This is my arm. This is my leg. You see yourself as a solid something. Someone who can stand far enough back might describe you the same way the electron is described, just as a probability distribution of energetic potential across some understanding of volume. The way the time structure works is actually much more like the electron. You, because like the electron, you would see yourself as existing and as being a solid and real thing, and everything else as being questionable because it's not you. You think of this as real and you as real, but in fact you're not. Time is not. This isn't a timeline. Across this time-space, this time volume, to give it a three-dimensional representation, this time volume, there is simply a probability distribution, a beautiful mathematical formulation of all of these different possibilities. And none of them is a concrete thing. Each blends into the others, making a constant flow of energy. None of them is distinct. There are not multiple timelines. There is a distribution of potential, which you would call realities, constantly flowing into one another so subtly that you couldn't perceive it. Right? And so you don't need to jump to another timeline like a passenger jumping from one train to another. You're already in a vast number of timelines. If you I suppose looked at it in terms of differential calculus, you're already an infinite number of timelines. You're spread across all of them, or however many there are. But because if we start looking at it as a single continuous distribution, you could conceivably break it up into smaller and smaller representations, which is what differential calculus does, which would make an infinite number of infinitely small timelines. Right? There is a single distribution of what is across this time-space. And when you understand that, it gets far simpler. You can understand that moving to another timeline is just shifting across the space, and then moving backwards and forward in time is just shifting across this space, this time space, this time volume. And so the confusion about how to understand a lot of things goes away. You don't wonder how all these snakes can wriggle through a tunnel at the same time and none of them bump into each other. In fact, there are not a bunch of snakes, there's a probability distribution. And because your awareness is very limited, you look at where you are and you think of it as solid and real. But it's not. Anybody who has developed their awareness sufficiently has at least had a glimpse of, I am one with everything. And maybe for just a moment they sense it, but they can never explain it. What they're doing is softening their awareness and expanding it enough that they begin to sense this, what you might call a probability reality distribution across the time volume. I mean, clearly that's a very loose description, but you could call it that. They sense this for just a moment, and they sense that they're not separate thems, but there's one them, and it's wrapped through all of this time and space. And when you understand it as something like that, rather than as a machine with, moving parts and German precision or Swiss clock precision, then things like the time paradox go away. Well, if you went back in time and killed your grandparents, what then? Because what happens is you are not a discrete unit moving through this. You only see yourself as that. Rather, you're part of a distribution. And if you shifted part of the distribution to another space, the system would compensate. There would simply be a redistribution of energy. And so rather than some time quake destroying everything because you killed your grandparents, what happens is simply that things jostle around and resettle in a new order. And what that new order is not something you could easily understand, because it goes across multiple dimensions of time and lots of different what you would call realities, and it would seem vastly complex. But it's actually a very simple and gentle redistribution of potentials across this space to keep things stable. And it goes on constantly. That is your reality. What you know as reality is shifting constantly, every second. Things that have never been are suddenly true, and everybody knows that. And things that couldn't be happen. And you don't think anything of it because you are part of this distribution. And so when it happens, you are equalized along with the distribution. And so it's all very simple. There is no vast complexity to it. There is no time paradox, no issues with killing multiple copies of yourself and gaining their mana. In fact, if you could do it, if you could shift through multiple time streams and kill enough versions of yourself, as in the movie with Jet Li, what you would find is that you would likely die. Because in general, you're decreasing the probability of your existence across the entire potential. And eventually you would decrease the probability of your existence low enough that you would cease to exist. And something else would shift to that space, and everyone around you would have no awareness that you ever existed because you wouldn't have. Time isn't a concrete linear thing. It doesn't just change. The entire system simply rebalances and you would never have existed, so it's not a problem. This is why it's very easy to go back in time and look at something from the past, or go forward and look at something from the future. And if you go forward and look at the future and see something you don't like, you're not stuck in some Oedipal dilemma. And I speak not of having to have sex with a parent, but rather the idea that you will make the future come true by trying to change it. In fact, you can easily change it. You can sense the potential for where this understanding of you is likely to be and simply make different decisions. And it doesn't break the system. It doesn't create confusion. You don't need a DeLorean. You're simply changing one single point in the probability distribution, and other points in this vast distribution will equalize. And again, I use point loosely because there are no points. It's simply a distribution of potentials. Right? So really you're just shifting your potential so that you experience another place in the time volume. A lot of the confusion, a lot of the messiness, a lot of the ick goes away. Now again, this is something that's probably difficult enough for most people to understand that they would just say, well, that's stupid, and ignore it. That's fine. At some point, when your scientists start trying to write a mathematics to represent the shape of the metacosmos, not the physical one that you can reach out and poke with a stick, but various times, past, future, integrating time and space, this will make it far simpler. Time and space are not even different. Einstein was right. They are all dimensions. And he said, but, stop doing that. He said, yes, they're both dimensions, but you can't do anything with them because they have different units. Well, that's silly. You put the units on them, not some God figure. Just put different units on them. Measure space in terms of centimeters or miles or hectares. Measure time in terms of kilometers, inches. You can put any units you want on it. They are all interchangeable dimensions. Now, for the sake of living in a reality you can understand, you have agreed to accept these particular ones as space and these particular ones as time. And so that's how you perceive them. But there could just as well be creatures moving through the three space dimensions, understanding those, the three time dimensions, understanding those as space, and understanding your three spatial dimensions as time. They're interchangeable. Now the actuality is, again, there's far more than 6. It's just that for the sake of comprehension, it's easier to understand 3, so I speak of it as 3. And functionally, if you as a scientist want to map this out, 3 is sufficient to get reasonable clarity in your equations and predictions as to what will happen. And as a sensor or a shaper, 3 is mostly sufficient to do what you need as far as sensing futures or past. Understanding 3 time dimensions and 3 spatial dimensions is functionally sufficient. In general, when I'm doing the deeper workings, I work in 9, sometimes as many as 15, but that's a very rare thing. Generally speaking, 6 is plenty to understand time and space, to chart future potentialities, to, in fact, predict the future by simply watching the math, see how things are shifting across those 6 dimensions and say, here's where it's going. To look back at someone's past and figure out when things happen in their life, or look at the future and say when they're going to die, or when something really wonderful is going to happen. It's really just a matter of understanding this. Well, not even understanding, because it's tough to understand 6 dimensions. It's simply a matter of accepting and working with those 6 dimensions. And the way you do it is you pick a single unit in space, like a single person, and then let your awareness wander across 3 time dimensions. And then it's not complicated. You don't have 3 dimensions to work with. It's up, down, left, right, front, back. Or picking a single moment in time and then wandering across the spatial dimensions. Let me drift over to the neighbor's house and see if there's a shower. Let me drift over to Africa and see if something's going on. And so functionally, as far as sensing or shaping, this is a sufficient number of dimensions. And see, the long and short of it is what I'm trying to do is take a bunch of really silly mechanistic ideas that should have died with the industrial age and bring both your science and your meta folks up to a more currently useful and more organic understanding of time and space. It is not some German machine or Swiss clock. It is simply a probability distribution, a distribution of potentials, and you yourself are distributed across that entire space, that entire volume, and you simply think of yourself as being locked into one and able to move through others, because that's where your awareness extends. But you can, at any given moment, sit your butt down and expand your awareness into any of these other dimensions. It's not that complicated. It just takes a set of perceptions most people don't have. But a good sensor, a competent sensor, can learn to do this. And so my intention here is to take this hugely complicated nest of ideas of parallel realities and time paradoxes and all this nonsense, snakes in a tunnel and whatnot, and simplify it down to a single artistic, aesthetic conceptualization, so that when you find any new idea, you don't have to try and figure out how you get another snake in the tunnel without bumping into other snakes. You can simply look at it from within this, what I hope is an aesthetic conceptualization, and easily put it into place. So that's the entire purpose here, creating a simple, harmonious aesthetic conceptualization. And whether anybody understands me, I don't know, but I feel like I've made it clear, simple. And moving forward, if you're not a scientist, a physicist, say, trying to write the equations, then you don't have to worry about them. If you're a sensor or a shaper, someone doing sensing or shaping, you can simply begin to imagine this conceptualization, this probability distribution, this set of potentialities. And you can begin to work with that. You can begin to study it and play with it and imagine sensing forward or backwards in time. Already most of you know how to do this. You say, are you grounded? Somebody grounds us, yes. Okay, were you when I asked? How do I know? Well, you just sense back in time. I mean, this is something you're teaching to yellow belts or orange belts. It's not complex. You're already shifting across the time volume. It's just a matter of having a holistic picture to understand what it is you're doing. And once you have that, you can shift to any alternate reality, any alternate time stream as you think of it, timeline, and study what's going to happen. You can see the future and detect potentialities and predict where things are going to go and what decisions will lead you where you need to. It's actually far more simple than it seems. The most complex piece here, besides accepting the picture, accepting the idea, the most complex piece is that there's more than 3 dimensions. But I've given you a way to work around that by simply fixing yourself in one set of 3 and working with the other 3. And when you can do that, when you can accept this basic idea and begin to play only 3 dimensions at a time, you'll find that it's really not complicated. All of the messiness goes away, and this simple aesthetic representation of what is makes your work much easier.